So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session on Games Nations Play. We have with us Gideon Haigh, considered one of the finest writers in cricket today. He's got about 40 books to his name. And Stephen Alomes, who's a writer, poet, teacher, and an artist. A little more introduction to Gideon. Apart from bowling off spin for Yara Club, Gideon's done.
Bowling medium pace these days.
Okay.
I aim to be the fastest bespectacled bowler at my club.
Okay. The South Yara Club. Right. And you still play, Gideon?
Still play, yeah.
Yeah. So he's done 40 books, and if my count's right, 27 of them on cricket. And they range from coverage of Ashes, Kerry Packer, his club cricket to the mighty Yaras, biographies of Border, Avison, Vaughan, Trumper, commentaries on the state of Aussie cricket, including one called Crossing the Line, on which we'll talk about. And he's also written business books on office cultures, CEO cultures, and a couple of non-fiction books on diverse topics for
abortion, asbestos,
yes,
true crime.
Mm-hmm. And his latest book, The Standard Bearers, is a commentary on the 8 Smith-less tests against India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, and that also we'll be talking about. And Stephen Alomes is a professor at RMIT, Tasmania, and he's written stories of varieties of Aussie nationalism, Nation at Last, with a question mark, war memory, Australian football, and Australian creative artists in London, a book called When London Calls. He paints expressionist portraits which explore the faces of populist leaders. And his yet-to-be-released book, Selective Ironies, is a collection of prose and poetry. We'll talk more about that later. So we have a body of work of about 50-odd books here, and we have about half an hour to talk and fit in all the wisdom into this half an hour. So let's get going straight away. And Gideon is going to represent games. Alomes is going to represent nations. And I'll call play, right? So that's games, nations, play. All right? So Gideon, the first question to you. And we're very intrigued by the Aussie approach to cricket, right? And your thoughts on how the Aussie cricketing culture has evolved over the years, and more in the context of what happened with the Smith-Warner incident and this win at all costs culture. How has it crept into the Aussie cricket, and who's accountable, and how are you dealing with it?
Well, I don't think it's crept so much as it's always been there. I mean, Australian cricket culture defines itself in contradistinction to English culture. So there's a degree of overlap, but we also have always tended to regard ourselves as prepared to go that little bit further, to be less inhibited, less restricted by the proprieties, and to have an eye on results, outcomes. We're very outcome-oriented because it mattered far more to us as a nation or as a group of colonies to excel on the cricket field, particularly in relation to our colonial forefathers. So I think that that's always underlain Australian cricket. You find evidence for it from very earliest days that Australian cricketers were tough, they were resourceful, they were pragmatic, they were greedy. When they mounted their initial tours to England in the 1870s, 80s and 90s, they were known for insisting on their share of the gate. They knew their value to the last penny. So they weren't necessarily hung up on looking good or moving in the right circles. We didn't in Australia have the distinction that existed in England between gentlemen and players, between amateurs and professionals. We were all sort of quite pragmatically about making money and playing good cricket. But as Hugh Trumbull, one of the great Australian bowlers of the early 20th century, said, "We have many great days on an England tour, but the best is always the last." and that meant that they were dividing up the spoils of the tour proceeds.
Right.
Of course, I guess the archetypal Australian cricketer, the one to which everyone genuflects and defers, is Bradman. And of course, Bradman was the acme of cricket productivity. He wasn't necessarily regarded as a great stylist, but he was regarded as the overpowering competitor, the man who set his own standards and lived by them within bounds of propriety. But there's certainly also evidence that Bradman played to the last chip of a bail and always wanted to win and always wanted to have the last word. In the 1970s, I guess Australian cricket was defined by that sort of marauding bunch of buccaneers, the Chappells and Lilly and Marsh, who played an uncompromising brand of cricket that was often accompanied by a salty tongue, and also, once again, an insistence on being paid correct freight, because ultimately they went off with Kerry Packer's private enterprise cricket circus because they insisted that the labourer is worthy of his hire. So these are all kind of preconditions to the cricket culture that we have at present. What overlays it now, or perhaps underlies it, is a kind of a vast cricket bureaucracy. The Cricket Australia is a large commercial organisation with an eye on the bottom line, and a dedication to producing cricketers, not simply because it's a matter of national pride, but because it's a good organisational outcome. We want the best cricketers in the world because then they will win games and then they will make the most money. It's as simple as that. And our cricketers have grown up within that system. They regard themselves not only as representatives of Australia, but leading individual careers. Careers that might take them into the Indian Premier League, for instance, or into other T20 leagues around the world. So they're also looking after themselves as well as kind of fulfilling their collective destiny in Australia. And I think they were some of the preconditions to what happened at Newlands in 2018. It was an accumulation of organisational pressures, group dynamics of a dressing room that was embattled at the time, that was looking down the barrel of losing another away series, poor leadership or a lack of leadership from a captain who had grown up within the system, who was a virtuoso individual who didn't necessarily understand the way in which to get the best out of a group of men, and players who had been indulged to a degree. They'd been protected for some time from the consequences of their own actions by an organisation that had convinced itself that this was the right way to go about playing cricket, that the way in which Australia would assert itself on the cricket field would be to make itself unpleasant to play against. They kind of succumbed to a touch of amour propre, if you like. All of those circumstances aligned, certain individuals liaised and related in some ways, and the outcomes become part of Australian cricket history. And a very salutary lesson for Australian cricket, because I think for a long time there'd been an undercurrent of discontent in Australia about the way in which its players represented the country. It had lacked to that point a rallying point around which to stage a protest. And it wasn't just the way in which Australians felt, it was the instantaneity with which they asserted their discontent and the absolute unanimity of that disapproval. From the Prime Minister downwards, I don't think any Australian didn't feel a profound sense of shame and disillusionment about what our cricket team had been up to in our names.
Right. So, I mean, I would actually like to see the president of CA resign along with Smith on that particular incident.
Well, there was a bit of a broom go through CA immediately after that. We lost the CEO,
Right.
we lost the chairman, we lost the senior most director, we lost the head of high performance, we lost the chief commercial officer. They were collateral damage in what took place, because it transpired that when Cricket Australia commissioned what they called a cultural review of the organisation and the team, there was a pretty widespread discontent, not only among members of the public, but among key stakeholders, corporate stakeholders, broadcasters and commercial backers of Australian cricket who weren't happy with the way in which the game was travelling.
Right, okay. Stephen, coming to you.
Yes, I was going to say that W.G. Grace didn't mind a pound or two either. He was the Donald Trump of cricket of his day. But let's go to the big picture and to things more important than cricket. I know that's hard for you to believe in India. Firstly, today, as many of you know, is Happy and Unhappy Australia Day, because it also is a recognition of an invasion. But I wanted to talk about the general aspect of Australian development. Australia was a product of the settler Australia after 1788, of the Industrial Revolution, imperialism, the cable, the telegraph. That's how come those early test matches were discovered. But Australian football, AFL, footy, and there is a local team, the Telangana Saints, by the way. Yep, the Telangana Saints. The Saints. I don't know where that fits into Modi's concept of religion in India, but it was developed before the full forces of the coming of the telegraph, the quality steamship, and all those English headmasters who came out to Sydney and Brisbane and said, look, we better play the imperial game, chaps, rugby. So we actually have a divide that the southern states of Australia all play Australian football, even though we now have teams around all the capitals. But it is, in those states, it's a secular religion. And the most important couple of points here are that, firstly, Australia is a pretty a-religious society. And Donald Horne said about sport, the writer, he said, sport to Australians is life and the rest a shadow. So there is a sense in which sport is fundamental to the culture. Sport, if you think of another aspect of Australia, Australia is a subject colony, but it's also a settler colony. Now, the English are very nice people, and they look down on colonials, whatever kind they happen to be. So they used to look down on Australians. And one of the Australian phenomena, which goes I'm going a little bit beyond Australian football, is the idea that sport will put us on the map. That we are a small, population-wise, we're a small, isolated country. And Olympic medals, Australia's first Olympic medal, 1896, Edwin Flack at Athens. India's first Olympic medal, wrestling in 1952. And I don't want to be comparative, but the point is that the Olympics have always been a rich nation's sport, and that's changing a little bit with professional coaching. But the idea is that sport would put us on the map, and that's the product of the two things, the colonial cultural cringe, the feeling of inferior, and in sport we could feel not inferior. The second aspect is what I call small country syndrome, the desire to be put on the map, to be noticed in the world, except for crocodile attacks and shark attacks and more recently bushfires. If you watch the news around the world, the only things about Australia, except when we have bushfires, are normally things like crocodile, sharks, tiger snakes, etc. But the other aspect that comes with sport is another desire to be on the map, which is a pretty crazy desire, and I'll go on a bit in a minute to populism and nationalism with some brief Indian comparisons, is the participation in other people's wars, as they've been called. Australia has participated in wars of the imperial powers, Britain and the US, since the early 1880s in Sudan, and by one measure we're talking 7 wars, and I'm leaving out World War I and World War II, 7 wars, another measure 9 wars. We love sending troops off to other people's wars. Our Veterans Association is called the Returned Services League, and there's been an inadequate recognition of the Aboriginal war against the invaders. Now, my family goes back to 1804 in Hobart, so I suppose they were invaders, although I feel no more guilt for whatever happened in the past than friends I have in Normandy for William the Conqueror and all of the above. So sport and war have both been ways to put us on the map and to transcend the colonial cultural cringe. And I can come back in a minute to both to the significance of Australian football, which is AFL, footy, Aussie rules, whatever. Not rugby, not rugby league, not soccer, not American football. And it's very, very important. And I want to ask a global question, and I'll pause after that. The global question is, this book, by the way, is The People's Game 1958 to 2058, which is the second centenary of the formation of the game. It was not a derivative game. It may or may not have had Aboriginal elements in it. But what is the future in 2058? And a couple of English soccer economics writers said, oh, it will just be a folk game played at folk festivals. The global world will take over. The whole world will be playing soccer and basketball. So that's a very interesting question in terms of an Indigenous tradition, because I would argue that we can have a secondary indigeneity. Those of us whose families go back for generations in a global world.
Thanks, Alomes. You answered several of my questions in that one. But your book on nationalism, A Nation at Last, how do you think that reflects in the way Australia plays sports?
Well, I think, again, as Gideon was saying, that the aim is to express that strong frontier, machismo character. I mean, I think it even may apply to some of our women athletes, though not to Ash Barty, who is brilliant and as well as charming. But to me, the big question about nationalism, and we see this in Australia at the moment, different politicians, they will jump on things. Bob Hawke, the Prime Minister, when Australia beat America in the America's Cup, the first time anyone beat them in 150 years, in a sport no one cares about, said you would be a bum if you didn't give everyone an employer and you didn't give them a holiday. His opponent, Malcolm Fraser, said, he put out a commercial saying Australians can run, Australians can jump, Australians can do this. Vote for us because we're the running, jumping government. So politicians love using sport. And I came later happy to talk about populism, which is only rarely about sport. Populism is more about a few nasty divide and conquer strategies.
Right. So we'll go back to Gideon.
Well, at the moment, it was interesting just before the Sydney Test match recently against New Zealand, when Australia was in the grip of climate catastrophe. Scott Morrison hosted the Australian cricket team to, I think, Kirribilli House, and he said that, despite the fact that, we're all in the grip of this terrifying environmental Armageddon, we'll all gather tomorrow around the televisions to watch the competition between our trans-Tasman cricketing warriors, and we'll draw great comfort from this. And it's this is actually not about Australia sort of honing its competitive edge. This is about sort of placidity and sport being the opiate of the peoples. Well, so in that sense, it's kind of integral to Scott Morrison's relaxed and comfortable political vision.
The critics call the current Prime Minister Scott from marketing, because he used to run marketing for Tourism New Zealand and then was sacked. And he then ran marketing for Tourism Australia, and he created the commercial, "Where the bloody hell are you?" which was banned in several countries because of the word hell, banned in other countries because of bloody, and was a complete failure. But he earlier actually said to some firefighters, "I'm sure the cricketers will help with your morale."
So, all right, Gideon. So when you think of Australian cricket, of course, the first thing that comes up is this concept of sledging. And is it a very Aussie thing, or have they picked it up from somewhere else, or how does it fit in this gentleman's game? And do you think?
Well, it's never been a gentleman's game in Australia. It's been a people's game, and it's always had a kind of a vernacular quotient. Like I said before, it's we define ourselves against the English. We're not as hung up or obsessed with the proprieties as the English are. It's curious when you do go to play cricket in England. I remember the first game that I played over there, just a club fixture. I was amazed at how quiet it was when I went into bat. Having grown up in Australia, where you are constantly surrounded by a sort of a barrage of noise, you tend to screen it out. You tend not to pay attention to it. It's like the bird song, really. Not as sweet as the bird song, but it's kind of part of the natural ambient surroundings. The other, of course, tradition about Australian cricket is that what happens on the field stays on the field. that you go hell for leather on the field, but afterwards there is a sort of a camaraderie and a comradeship between teams, and that's certainly something I've found to be true in Australia. We do know that there is a place for competitiveness, and we are capable of putting a kind of a cordon sanitaire around it. Australians are always slightly surprised when other cultures express any kind of disquiet about this. And of course, over the years, no matter what other teams have said about sledging and on-field kind of abrasion, a lot of other countries have adopted it at the same time. You know, Virat Kohli on the field does not take a backward step. So imitation, I guess we would regard as the serious form of flattery.
Could I come in there, because I think there's an interesting argument. I've argued that Australia is an a-religious country, even though it has some forms of religion and churches and different things in its multicultural self. It's also a fairly a-philosophical country. Australians interact socially face to face, in conversation, in what was once called a social democracy of manners. It didn't really apply to the elite, but it did apply to the rest. And one of the things that happened was in the Australian Football League, the matter of racial vilification against players of Aboriginal origin or American origin or African origin, there was a campaign against it, which with one major exception has been extremely successful because they did the right thing. They had a fusion of penalties, mediation and education. So the AFL at that level has almost eliminated, with the one exception of the attacks on the player Adam Goodes, who was Australian of the Year and spoke out on Aboriginal situations. The AFL has eliminated that, not at local level, but it has eliminated on the field. You may find an odd spectator in 300,000 people at the weekend who will make, banana remarks, and they will usually be evicted and banned. But on the whole, on the field, it's been because the players have participated in it, and change in Australia. That's why sport. People say, "Oh, sport is a pattern of prejudice. Sport mirrors society. It reflects all our prejudices." But sport can also be a vehicle for progressive change.
I mean, look, I've played cricket. I'm 54 now, and I've played club cricket since the age of 9. I can honestly say that I've never heard a racial epithet on the field. Now, that's partly accounted for by the fact that probably in the first sort of 2/3 of my career, there weren't a great variety of races playing the game. But what's happened at club level in Australia, at least in an urban setting over the last 10 or 15 years, is that cricket certainly has been revolutionised by the high levels of South Asian migration. And for instance, my club would now be at least a third South Asian, and they mix very readily and very easily, and they're extremely welcome club members because they're vastly enthusiastic and positive about the game. You know, we just simply could not operate these days without our contingent of Indians and Bangladeshis and Sri Lankans and Pakistanis. And it's interesting, over the course of that last 15 years, there have been sort of waves of the players coming through, the levels of ambition that they've aspired to. First of all, they came along and they simply wanted to play. They simply wanted to get involved. They simply wanted to come down and train and play. Next, they began to think about whether they'd like to be captains, and they became captains. And in the last 2 or 3 years, we've had a lot of them have begun serving on our committee, become administrators, who've actually become part of the effort of keeping the show on the road. And that's happened without anyone kind of exhorting us from the outside, without any kind of program enforced from Cricket Australia head office. It's just happened as a natural process that when you make people welcome, when you make them feel valued, and when you're joined together in a game that everyone loves, things just happen. Marvellous things happen without your even being aware of them.
Right, wonderful. That's nice. Stephen, you've written about Australian football, and I watched a bit of it on YouTube, and it's quite rough, and you don't have protection at all. No, just a sec. So does this footy does it reflect Aussie spirit best among all the games?
Well, it does in a sense that Australia had a strong influence from the frontier, which was physically hard work. It wasn't we had a lot of technology to develop the frontier. But I think what we have to do with sport is watch the current developments, because if you go to an Australian football club, the top clubs, which are like corporate castles, it's very hard to get into. But the one place you might have a look at is the gym. And the gym has taken over. And this has happened with all sport. So the gym, sports science, defensive strategies. You know how Johnny Wilkinson destroyed rugby because he didn't need tries, he just kicked goals. The zoning has come from basketball. The negative sport and negative play. We play on cricket fields, 180 metres to 150 wide approximately. There's no specification. But what actually happens is the coaches basing it on negative play in English Premier League soccer, in basketball zoning, and also with the use of the gym and the tackling. Tackling numbers have gone up from 30, 40 a match to 140 a match. And they basically, and this has happened with sport, and I believe that it is Australian football's appeal was because it played on this large field, so players could jump, players could run, there was a place for small players, tall players, skills, teamwork, etc. But what we're having now is we're having people playing to their zones. And I don't know, and the other thing that we're having as well, and Gideon can talk about this too, is the rise of instant sports, different versions, and there are versions that are happening we now have an AFL women's competition, which is massively popular, but they also experimented, as with rugby sevens and the other short form of rugby, they experimented with short forms and smaller players. But to me, this game is now influenced by rugby union, rugby league in tackling, by zoning from basketball and zoning from soccer. Remember, it was the Chelsea manager used to park the bus. You win the home game, and so you park the bus for the other one. You just basically want to stop scoring. Now, Australian football, the scoring is often 120 points. We kick lots of goals. And may I say also, by the way, there are matches in China now aiming to get, I think, the Australian Chinese population more involved. And I see lots of Indians at the football, and there is talk of matches in India. But the world of sport, in the war of the sports, part of the war is to attack women, and part of the war is to create instant sports. But also, as I said, the problem of coaches and managers, what do they want to do? They want to win. And that is not good for the spectator. It's not good for the aesthetics. I wrote an article once on Australian football and the aesthetics of the game. But aesthetics are now been taken over by tackling.
All right. So you would agree that it represents Australian spirit at the best, this game?
Well,
it's the most watched sport in Australia.
It has bigger attendances than any sport in any football in the world except for German soccer, and the very special environment of either NFL or college football, where people go to college football in the US for loyalty to the college, not for the sport. So it is very popular, but to me it is under threat. And I'll just read three lines from a poem that I wrote called Footy's Changed. Footy's changed. Once upon a time after school we played kick to kick and stretch matches. Now it's different. Dumb announcers, loud PA. The field is clogged, some keepings off, tackles first, rugby now. Players spouting media cliches. And I end with, after school footy was so much better. We played the game at a higher level.
That's nice. So Gideon, this thing about instant sports, your views on IPL and the Premier Leagues going around?
Well, just to go back to Stephen's point before, I think that one of the slightly surprising and counterintuitive things about sport in Australia is, even though it's become a very media-saturated environment and there's an enormous amount of sport available on television at the click of a button, there is still a very strong tradition of live attendance at sport, and that's to the credit of administrators. They've realised that perhaps partly because so much is shown on television, you can't hide a sterile sporting arena which is empty. Having a crowd in the audience is a good look for television. It kind of corroborates the home viewer's interest in what they're watching. So AFL is very highly attended, as is the Big Bash League, as are Test matches. You know, we just had a Test match at the MCG Boxing Day game against New Zealand. It's the highest attendance for any team apart from England in a Test match in Australia. It was over 205,000 people over 4 days, and it wasn't a great Test match. People just went along because of the occasion, because of the event. And there's an event mentality has crept into sporting spectatorship. You know, you go because it's a big deal, not necessarily because you're a fanatical supporter. But that is something that's remained despite the encroachments and erosions of broadcasting. The curious thing is, at the same time, the values of broadcasting have been imposed on the live experience. If you go to a cricket match, if you go to a football match now, people always have half an eye trained on the giant video screen, don't they? Not only to see the action, but perhaps to see themselves. People love seeing themselves up on the screen. They love mugging for the cameras.
There is tradition as well. The Melbourne Boxing Day Test, the Sydney New Year's Day Test, the Adelaide December Test. And there are single tests which are a kind of ritual in those towns. But you're absolutely right. I mean, you have to wear earplugs now. And you can't talk to people, you can't listen to the radio, because there are dumb announcers who are very good. I hope I'm not doing it. They bite the mic. They're mic biters.
What do I think of the IPL and T20? Well, they're kind of there. There's two aspects to that. There's the commercial side of the playing side, and I think that T20 is a triumph of the players. The players' capacity to assimilate new skills. The players' desire to outdo one another. We've seen things happening in this generation that were undreamt of 10 years ago. It's quite staggering, the flexibility and versatility and athleticism of the modern cricketer. In some respects, you know, Virat Kohli is, we were talking about athleticism before, Virat Kohli has brought athleticism to Indian cricket in ways that we could never have possibly imagined. You know, there have been very fit Indian cricketers before, your Kapil Devs and your MS Dhonis, but no one has made fitness an almost sort of philosophical underpinning of their game in the way that Kohli has. You know, he is an advertisement of his own sort of body cult. And that's part of the reason why he's been such an extraordinarily successful cricketer across all three formats. You know, he has the physical endurance that enables him to master Test cricket, he has the explosive energy that's integral to 50-over cricket, and he has the explosive power that's essential to T20 cricket. And he is kind of the model for the cricketer of the next generation, the one that everyone kind of aspires to. As far as the commercial side of T20 is concerned, the kind of the second and third order effects of a T20-centric cricket economy are disquieting. The effects cannot be quarantined, they cannot necessarily be contained. We've only got 12 months of the year, and I think administrators worldwide have a profit-maximising mentality. They want to make the best possible use of the cricket calendar as it stands, and that underlies initiatives like 4-day test matches, day-night test matches, a desire to kind of contain and reduce and marginalise Test cricket in order to pursue top dollar.
Could I just say the war of the sporting worlds is a war of the calendar, because soccer was failing low attendance at the sport, so it moved to summer, where it just competes against basketball and against cricket. Everyone is now expanding. They're having special competitions in February. The rugby league, the NRL and the AFL, they're having competitions in February. All sports are trying to creep the calendar. We've had winter test matches in Australia in, I think, Darwin or up north somewhere. So it's a battle for the calendar. It's a battle for loyalties. It's a battle for money. It's a battle for product. So the war of the sporting worlds is a very strange thing. And the other side of it is, of course, the participation rates are down. And the question is, does the government spend too much money on the Australian Institute of Sport? 1976, we didn't win a gold medal at Montreal. So the idea of an Institute of Sport had been around for 2 or 3 years, but the government set up an Institute of Sport to try to bring more sports science, to bring Czech sailing coaches and things like that to improve our performance.
The war of the calendar is evinced by what we've just seen in India, of course, because for the first time in living memory, we've had no ODI cricket in Australia this summer because Australia came over here to play an ODI series against India at its insistence. And now, over the last 4 or 5 years, India has built up its own season, which happens to coincide with Australia's season. And only one country can win that because it's one country that calls the shots. I mean, India is coming out to Australia next summer for 4 test matches, and it's going to be a terrific series. I'm really looking forward to it. But that is a considerable concession from India to let their international team go abroad at the peak of their new season for such a long period of time.
Right. So right now there's a battle for time, and we only have 3 minutes left. One quick answer to this question. Do you think the culture of the nation affects the way the sport is played, or do you think it happens vice versa also, that the way the sport is played also affects the culture of a nation?
I mean, Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message, the form is the content. And what we now have this phenomenon of young people who live in a world of e-games, which e-games are more popular than movies in the Western world at least. So it is the new technologies which are actually shaping things. So it's not a single culture. And it's a global world. There are the biggest country in the world for NBA access screen passes is Australia. So the world is being reshaped. But we won't get around to populism, but if anyone wants to come up afterwards, and I'm not an expert on Modi, but populism is about blaming people, dividing, fear, distraction. You know, we've seen it all with the Donald. But can I say, if you put my name on Instagram, you'll see my paintings of populist leaders. If you have a look at page 20 of the program, you'll see I'm the only photograph, which is a photograph of a painting, which Vijay didn't want. So I'm trying to be as big as the Kardashians. So I have 70 followers on my Instagram site, but I have Trump, I have Berlusconi, the failed Hillary Clinton, Rupert Murdoch, the evil Rupert Murdoch. We are very pleased he's an American now.
I work for him.
He writes for Rupert Murdoch. Yeah. He's part of the 20% of the newspaper that's worth reading. But so go put Stephen Alomes into Instagram. But I'm very happy also to informally talk about populism and Modi, because I sense authoritarian populism, the politics of fear, the politics of blame, the idea that the ordinary people are forgotten. Once that used to happen, just outsiders would do that. In Australia, Pauline Hanson, with very few members of Parliament, she would do that. Now our Prime Minister talks about quiet Australians. Trump talks about make America great again, etc. So there is a lot of the games that politicians play, which are about populism, are about nation, are about trying to find people to blame. And the man who spoke first yesterday was telling me that the Indian elite who read the Times Literary Supplement and the New York Review of Books, that they in one sense are the expert targets of Modi when he says they don't understand the ordinary people. As in France, the bourgeois bohemians, the politically correct, the identity politics people, are seen as the people out of touch with the real France if you're a right-wing populist. So the games that politicians play are also part about populism, is also a form of populist nationalism, and sometimes they, as I said, with ScoMo and cricket will keep you happy. Sport can come in as well.
Right, you can add a portrait of BCCI to that.
I'm definitely. I have 3 to do. I have to do Modi, Bolsonaro, and Bojo. I refuse to do Duterte. He's just a criminal thug.
Right. Quickly give us something, so we can take questions.
I can't offer you anything, really. I'm not on Instagram. I'm not on Twitter. I'm not on Facebook.
You write for
my books aren't even here, so you're just going to have to come up and talk to me, I'm afraid.
All right, questions? Where are the mics? Yeah. in the black T-shirt. Kinship.
Gideon, I'm a big fan of your writing and a massive fan of Australian cricket. There has been a decline. Like obviously, we know what has happened, and the Ashes tour to England was probably one of the weakest teams that Australia sent. Other than Stephen Smith's runs, they wouldn't have drawn the series. What in your mind is going on in Australia today with Cricket Australia, writers like you, and the past greats like Border, Ponting, and Wong, to kind of bring up the standard and have a great team again?
Well, I mean, Australian cricket was, the simplest way to explain this is to say that Australian cricket was the perfect size, was perfectly fit for purpose in the old cricket world, in the sense that our first-class system involving 6 states was designed to create 11 really good test cricketers. And we set our stall for that purpose. As cricket has grown, as cricket's become sort of exponentially more complicated, the strains on that system have become more acute. We now have a Big Bash League that's 8 franchises, basically derived from 6 state squads, which inevitably results in a kind of a dilution of the quality of cricket. We tried to make up for that by creating a kind of a high-performance system to kind of fast-track cricketers through, academies and local development programs. But I don't think that's come naturally to Australian cricket, and it has created a breed of Australian cricketers that feel that haven't perhaps had to work quite as hard as previous generations have to get to the top. They've received all the advantages, and the previous system was quite Darwinian. It did weed out the weaker species. That doesn't happen in Australian cricket these days. You can go a long way on not very much if you're regarded as promising, if your talents and your personality happen to fit the system. So it's not as ruthless a game as it used to be, and I don't think these players are as ruthless as they used to have to be. You can make an awful lot of money in Australian cricket these days, unexampled sums of money. I mean, look at Pat Cummins. I mean, Pat Cummins is a terrific player, but it's just extraordinary for him to have had a payday like he's had during the recent IPL auction. There's still a sense of kind of disbelief about how far an Australian cricket career can go, and we're adapting to the new realities of the modern cricket economy. I would say about the 2019 Ashes, and I was there reporting them for the Australian at the Times, even though it wasn't a particularly great Ashes series and it wasn't 2 particularly great teams, it was a very good series in the sense that the 2 teams were quite well matched, they were quite well coached and well led, they were well resourced, and they were very resilient teams. They both had to come back from adversity in the course of that series. Australia was 8 for 120 on the first day and won the first Test match. England were bowled out for 67 at Headingley and ended up winning the Test match. Australia bossed it in the 4th Test and lost in the 5th Test. So it was a series which had genuine ebb and flow. And so perhaps in a sense, if the talent wasn't quite there, the temperament was. The temperament did shine out. And it was played willingly and in a good spirit. And frankly, I would much prefer a series like 2019 to something like 2017-18, which was, basically one punch finished it. Right. You have to be thankful for small mercies these days.
First of all, happy Australia Day to all the Aussies.
Someone here who wants to...
Happy Republic Day.
Thanks. My question here is, do you feel in the future ahead, like ECB, BCCI and Cricket Australia forming a clique of sorts and playing more often amongst them, and it's going to lead to a burnout like or India just toured Australia last year, we are touring again next year. Yeah. Somewhere there is going to be some fatigue happening?
Yes. Yeah, fan fatigue for sure, yeah. I mean, I think already they operate as a kind of a clique because their economic interests are usually reasonably closely aligned. Of course, they're aligned totally back in 2014 when they tried to pull the Big Three scam on the rest of the countries around the world. Paul Keating, an Australian politician, Prime Minister, once said, always back self-interest because at least you know it's trying. Self-interest underpins virtually everything that those boards do. But ultimately, both the ECB and Cricket Australia are going to have to be pretty wary of the BCCI, because the BCCI ultimately suits itself and operates according to a series of interior agendas. It's increasingly, well, it's always been aligned with politics in India, but with the advent of Jay Shah as the BCCI secretary, that kind of gives it a direct connection to the BJP, and it's connected to the BJP in a number of states. There are all sorts of subterranean agendas in Indian cricket that I think that Australian cricket is very poorly informed about. It's surprising how naive Cricket Australia directors and executives are about the way in which cricket operates in India, and the kind of the turbo capitalism that governs its commercial imperatives. It's riding the tiger, to use the old expression, when you cozy up to India, because ultimately it will pursue its own ends and be quite unabashed about doing so.
Thanks for that very fascinating discussion. And Gideon, I really loved the glimpse you gave of the political economy of the cricketing world. And as someone who doesn't follow the cricket, I was really interested in what you were saying. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, with the, you kind of suggested, you gave us a hint of, how audiences are changing with increasing immigration from South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. I was wondering if you could talk about how, what it means to be an Australian cricketer is changing, what it means to be, what does Australian cricket mean, and how is that changing? The whole concept of Australianness with so many Indian Australians, yes, Pakistani, Bangladeshi Australians, in how is that changing the political economy of the game?
Yeah, well, you're right. It is. I wouldn't want to overstress the kind of the philanthropic aspect of this. There is a desire in Cricket Australia to develop what they call new markets, and they include women who've been, historically hugely neglected in Australian cricket. There is a desire to kind of tap into the enthusiasm for cricket felt in South Asian communities, because it's perceived that they are they're good citizens. They're people who bring their culture with them, but assimilate relatively easily. What it means at a kind of a grassroots level is that you do actually have to be much more sensitive to the particular priorities and predicaments of the players that you're seeking out. I mean, where my cricket club is concerned, we do a lot of our recruiting through Google. It's as simple as that. If you Google South Yarra Cricket, our website is the first one that comes up. So if you move into that area, or if you're sort of in general proximity and you want to play some cricket, we're the first club that you will come to. We provide a provision for you to email us. We pride ourselves on the fact that we're very responsive. If a member of the committee will get back to you within a couple of hours of your email arriving, and we will kind of immediately set you up. We will equip you with a shirt, with gear. We will ensure that you probably don't have a car if you've recently arrived. We'll ensure that we'll pick you up on the way to training and we'll get you home. We'll create a kind of an internet ID for you, which allows you to fit into the MyCricket system. And what you make of it thereafter is kind of up to you, but we'll do our best to help you along the way. It's certainly a much more inclusive environment than Australian cricket was when it kind of took for granted that people would just rock up. The first cricket clubs that I joined were not particularly inclusive. They didn't make outsiders friendly. They were pretty white bread, but that's changed. And like I said, not because of any outside influences, but also because of self-interest. Clubs realise that if they're going to survive, then they're not going to be able to depend on the traditional white male in middle age to support them, not only because those numbers are kind of dwindling, but because the working week is so much more atomised than it used to be. The idea that you worked during the week and you played sport at weekends has been completely undermined by deregulation of the labour market and the realities of the modern economy.
Could I come in there? There are two aspects. The dropout rate of adolescents from all sorts of sports. Three aspects. The rise of women. The rugby sevens won the Rio World Cup. The fastest growing, despite the enormous soccer numbers, the fastest growing sport in Victoria is women's footy, AFL footy. But the third aspect, which is most important, is that sports clubs provide an important break on the problems of adolescent depression, including suicide and other matters. So sports clubs have been very, very important for adolescents because as they make a transition to adulthood.
And as a result of being involved in cricket over the last 10 or 15 years, you know, I've been to Indian weddings, I've been to Bangladeshi weddings, I've been to citizenship ceremonies, things that I would otherwise not have been exposed to. But it is a cliche that a sporting club, a good sporting club, is a genuine melting pot where differences melt away. Who do I support? Well, I don't support. I've got to the stage now where I really do just want to see good cricket. I want to see Test cricket prosper, and I want to see people enjoying themselves at a grassroots level. It doesn't really bother me. One thing about the modern kind of South Asian player who joins our club is that they are incredibly well informed about all forms of cricket going on anywhere. You know, I think as a journalist, I'm abreast of modern cricket happenings. The guys at my club are just incredibly switched on about what's happening everywhere, in every T20 league around the world, in every international fixture that's taking place. I mean, I've got to the age now where I have other priorities in my life apart from cricket, but these boys, they really know the game backwards and they are totally in love with it, and in that sense they are fantastic club members.
I was going to say that as a journalist, what Gideon wants, and he's always a good analyst, but he wants a good story.